Can the symptoms of autism be reversed? What is autism? Is it on the increase, along with neurodivergence, as 1 in 6 children have special educational needs? Can this simply be explained by overdiagnosis and genes? I'm joined in this podcast by 3 pioneers with experience between them of thousands of children diagnosed with autism. Dr. Lorene Amet from the Lauriston Centre in the UK, Dr. Heather Talman-Room, and the founder of Documenting Hope, Beth Lambert, both to examine the size of the iceberg and what lies beneath. That explains why our children's mental and physical health is under attack. Dr. Lorene Amet holds a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Oxford, with a master's in autism education, and has done postdoctoral research at both Princeton and Edinburgh universities. Beth Lambert is the founder of the not-for-profit organization DocumentingHope.com and a teacher and an author of numerous books, including A Compromised Generation and co-author of Brain Under Attack. Dr. Heather Talman-Room is a board-certified physician with a master's in public health policy and has served as both a college professor for over a decade and is the medical advisor for Documenting Hope. So it's fantastic to have the 3 of you here today, such a lot of knowledge and wisdom in one place. And Beth, first I'm going to turn to you as the founder of Documenting Hope. I read your brilliant article on what is autism, but in a nutshell, what is autism?
Well, autism is a diagnostic label that we apply to a set of symptoms and behaviors that are observed. It's a subjective diagnosis, meaning there's no blood test that has been fully validated yet that's used in autism, although I think that's coming. And essentially, it is a very broad diagnostic category. In other words, it applies to children who have neurodevelopmental challenges. They may not speak, they may have motor difficulties, they may have GI symptoms, they may have sensory symptoms. And then it also is a term that applies to people who are, able to function fully in life and have a set of symptoms like social anxiety and maybe sensory issues. And so it covers a broad swath of symptoms. Now, if you ask what autism really is, I would say it's an adaptation that has neurological features to it, and it's an adaptation to living in the modern world. And so what does that mean? It means that our bodies have a response to stimulus, and over time, as infants develop in utero and in the neonatal years, they develop along a normal human trajectory. And when that normal human trajectory is impaired, stalled, delayed, interrupted for a variety of reasons, could be inflammatory exposures, could be toxic exposures, could be lack of nutrition, a whole host of things. When that developmental trajectory is impaired, stalled, delayed, that's when you start seeing symptoms that look like what we call autism, the sensory symptoms, the issues with motor planning, the issues with speech, the issues with interacting socially and not being able to effectively interact socially. So that is, again, a very high level description of what autism is. But as the old saying goes, if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. So it's a label that I actually would argue isn't super helpful because it is so broad. And it is something that we need to look at, maybe realigning to what the symptoms are, coming up with a new set of diagnostics labels or possibly subtyping because it is so broad.
So, Lorene, what's your take on that? And also, should we really be more addressing the particular symptoms of a child or person as opposed to necessarily labeling them with autism?
So first of all, I would say I agree with what Beth have just said. However, I will add that autism is diagnosed using a set of gold standard diagnostic assessments, looking at the social communication and behavior of the children. And so motor planning alone is not autism. It has to have this triad of impairment, or according to the DSM-5, two main domains, social communication and behavioral abnormalities. But there is no biomarkers, whether blood, urine, whatever. I think I often refer to autism as a collection of syndromes using the nomenclature from Professor Gilbert, who is well established in the field of autism. So we have for over 30 decades now recognized that autism can be caused by a wide range or associated with a wide range of developmental disorder with different etiologies, so different causes. Going back to your last question, Patrick, very briefly, when you say, do we want to address the symptoms? We want to understand why every child is experiencing these difficulties so that we can see if there are any modifier we could use to at least reduce the severity and sometimes vastly improve to the point of losing the diagnosis.
So the point really, which of course we're going to get into deeply, is what are the possible causes of these symptoms or behaviors. Now, there's a few words which some members of the public won't understand: motor, sensory, behavioral. Heather, as a practitioner who's there face to face with kids with autism, I know there are adults with autism as well. What does that mean? What are you actually seeing in people, in children that are, within this term autism? Sensory, behavior, motor. What does this mean?
Well, you think about it very practically in the day-to-day life of parents, for instance, and what it means to do things with your children that you'd always hoped and dreamed of doing with your children. So whether that's going to the pool or that's getting up, sleeping through the night, whether that's being able to read to them and see their developmental skills, whether that's able to be comfortable in their clothing, whether they're able to have a bowel movement more than once a week. Those are very real ways in which those symptoms are manifesting for families. When you get into some of the more kind of areas of greater impact in terms of the family and the family dynamic, we have an epidemic, I would say, almost of what we call PANS or PANDAS, which is neuroinflammation. And when you hear from those parents that can't even bring their children to the practitioner's office, oftentimes, or anywhere in public, they're children whose brains are on fire. And so they are really acting with such discomfort and outrage or anger. And I think all of us have experienced those children when they have those symptoms addressed. And I don't mean just Band-Aid addressing that, but as Lorene said, looking at the root causes, or as Beth said, whether it's a toxicity, a deficiency, chemical, trauma, emotional, physical, otherwise, when you start to see that turn around and children have their life back, or they're not suffering from that thing that makes life difficult for them and their families, you often see a sadness of sorrow for having been in that state, having behaved, quote unquote, that way. So oftentimes we see those symptoms manifest in what we call behaviors, but behaviors have an underlying cause as well. So what is it? Is it lack of sleep? Is it a mitochondrial problem? Is it a genetic predisposition? And we can probably get into that a little bit more in a minute. But what are those things that are causing a burden to the body, or what we call a total load? And it's really that modern living, as Beth said, that you have so many things impacting a child that you have to start to move some of those away. So practically speaking, it's making life very difficult in the school setting, in the grocery store, to walk in the street, to feel that their child is safe, to know that they're going to be safe after the parents are no longer. So the impact on society is huge. And we see that in very day-to-day living ways.
And there are a number of terms around. So not so long ago, we would talk about ASD, autism spectrum disorder. Now, some say you can't call it that. It's autistic spectrum syndrome. Then we have neurodivergence, and some say we are all neurodivergent. Generally, at the charity Food for the Brain, we say we are all neurodiverse, we are all different. But an extreme of neurodiversity is such that it's affecting, one's ability to cope and function and behave and so on, and we call that subset neurodivergent. And then broadly in the UK, it is said that 1 in 6 are neurodivergent, and broadly 1 in 6 require special educational needs. So, they're not, exactly the same thing, but the public are confused. There are these terms, neurodivergent. Is autism a sort of subset of that, with other labels like ADHD in there as well? What do we, is neurodivergent a good term? And how do we relate to that in the context of autism? Any of you, please jump in.
I'd love to respond to that because I think that we've seen this word neurodivergent and this word neurodiversity emerge in the last decade or so. And I think it has been coming from a good place of trying to make sure that all people who have different ways of thinking or who have unique ways of interacting with the world are included, are accepted, are loved for who they are. I think that comes from a very good place. I do love that the idea that we're all neurodiverse. Of course we are, right? We all have different ways of thinking and our brains all operate differently. I think where that becomes a little bit of an issue, using that word neurodiversity or neurodivergent, is when we dismiss frank medical problems that individuals have and just say, well, they have this label. It's called autism, autism spectrum disorder, autism spectrum syndrome, and therefore they are neurodivergent. And so therefore we just accept them who they are, and we don't need to change anybody. I think that comes from a good impulse. Like, of course, we accept people for who they are, but not at the expense of dismissing medical problems as if they're part of that neurodivergent. And what I mean by medical problems would be gastrointestinal issues, inflammation in the body. As Heather said, you can actually verify that many of these kids who are quote unquote neurodivergent, whether that's ADHD, ASD, whatever the label is, even learning disabilities, you can find evidence of inflammation in their body, evidence of oxidative stress, evidence of nutritional imbalances, evidence of microbial imbalances in the gastrointestinal tract. So there's these issues that can be addressed that are medical, that oftentimes contribute to the symptoms or the features that we call neurodivergent. So as an example, attention, inability to focus, inability to sit still, we might call that individual who has those symptoms neurodivergent. But oftentimes that inability to sit still or focus might be related to an imbalance in gut bacteria in the microbiome. And that's actually addressable. And so by addressing that microbiome, you might be able to actually have those neurodivergent symptoms, attention and focus, go away. You could also do it through a therapy called through developmental optometry, through reflex integration. There's so many therapies that are used to help support and optimize the health and functioning of people who are neurodivergent. So I think the risk of using the term neurodivergent is only a risk when we ignore the frank medical issues or functional or physiological imbalances that exist in that same child. So it's a complicated topic, and it also gets wrapped up in identity politics. And I think that's where things get dangerous for people who have those labels.
Just Beth, I just wanted to add to that. I think sometimes when you give other examples, it makes it more clear also if you get out of the realm of say autism and let's say a Down syndrome child, they can have a profoundly improved life or an optimal, let's say, life if you are addressing their detoxification pathways, their nutrition. You're looking into some of those same biomarker tests that although they don't give you the diagnosis, because we know Down syndrome comes from a genetic diagnosis, but those other things we can look at that are kind of downstream of modern living may be manifesting in ways we call, we, as Beth said, the risk is to write that off as that's part of the Down syndrome, or that's part of his or her autism. So I think that is a really, really important point she made. Similarly, if you take other conditions, let's say in adults, like somebody with MS, multiple sclerosis, is there multiple sclerosis due to overburden of heavy metals in their system, or is it due to a deficiency? Is it due to both of those in conjunction with a person that happens to be poor at metal detoxification? Or if somebody has the word for the diagnosis Alzheimer's, what does that mean? Could it be due, and we've seen this when we run people's genetics and things, that somebody may be poor at detoxification of heavy metals. So they're doing all the right things. They're eating fish 3 times a week to be healthy, and they're retaining those metals, and that's causing brain inflammation. So unless we look under the tip of the iceberg, and or make a distinction between these different ways in which people are manifesting. And I think Sid Baker, who is kind of one of our leaders in the field of understanding autism from a biologic standpoint, physiologic standpoint, his quote is, are we all the same people with different diseases, or are we all different people with the same disease? And if you say this is modern living,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I want to make one point. I was working in a special needs school doing a project for, I think it was Trevor McDonald tonight at the time. And, this is just one example. We had a girl, cerebral palsy. So we're talking about oxygen damage to the brain at birth. I'm unable to walk without a walking frame. And of course, the assumption is they just are the way they are, and let's love them and give them what makes them happy, which in this case was generally ice cream. They just loved ice cream. And we ran a food intolerance test, and this girl was actually allergic to milk. And on the elimination of milk, and we also gave her some vitamins and omega-3s, she ended up not needing a walking frame. So this is a girl that was damaged at birth, but there is still room for improvement. And it reminded me, when I met the Dalai Lama, he said that every human being wants to be happy and free of pain. And his daily meditation, he said, was to remember that his desire to be happy and free of pain was no greater or lesser importance than those of the people he met. So the question is the person we're with, is the child happy and free of pain? And if not, could we investigate what those underlying causes are, which I know you're dying to get into, but I need to ask one question before we, look at under the iceberg, so to speak. And that is autism on the increase? So let's start with the UK. Lorene, is autism on the increase?
Yes, it is on an increase. So the official statistics is 1 in 62, but we have different school census throughout the UK. And I have just reviewed the Scottish census, which in my opinion is one of the most detailed census. So every year they count the number of children diagnosed with autism. And now we have 5.2%. So it's more than 1 in 20. And because we have more boys than girls, it's about 1 in 15 boys. This is a lot. And the school census also include a wide range of conditions. So we have over 40% of children in secondary school who have some kind of additional needs, social, behavioral, emotional disorder, dyslexia. All of these are essentially on an increase, but autism very sharply on an increase. We have to keep in mind also there is a huge waiting list for diagnostic services between 2 and 5 years before the children are being diagnosed. So this is most likely an underreporting.
And this is a
big problem.
Yeah, this is a massive number. What's happening in the US, Beth or Heather?
We're seeing the same increase. The official statistics from the Centers for Disease Control are 1 in 36 children have an autism spectrum disorder. But we know that number, it doesn't quite meet the reality. In fact, the CDC updates their numbers every 2 years, and they're always wrong. It's always, the prevalence is always greater than they estimate. We estimate it's at least 1 in 31. There's some epidemiological studies that put it at 1 in 20 in some locations like California. Utah has a higher rate as well. And again, there's a lagging in the data reporting. So we think it's higher than that. And one of the things that's really tricky about the whole idea that there's an autism epidemic, that we're seeing an explosion in cases, is that people will argue, well, we're just better at diagnosing. So there's not more cases of autism. We just are capturing more that we didn't capture before. And the problem with that argument is, well, they're correct, first of all, that we are better at capturing some cases. So there might be, for instance, adults who don't get diagnosed till they're 30 or 40, who quote unquote masked some of the symptoms, but their social anxiety and sensory symptoms finally got them their diagnosis later in life. That's true. But what's also true is you have about 40% of people who have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis are considered moderate to severe. And these are cases you would not miss. You can't mask around a moderate to severe diagnosis. This means that there's substantial impact and substantial compromise to their ability to function in a school setting, in daily life. So I don't think that you could, I can't attribute all of the increase to better diagnosing or diagnostic substitution or these other kinds of excuses that people give when you're talking about 40% of people, like maybe are non-speakers, maybe can't toilet on their own, maybe can't do much independently. And those are not cases that you would just miss. And so I think that's our best way of understanding that this is a frank epidemic and not just our system is better at picking people up.
Lorene.
Now, I will add two things to this. If we look at the age distribution for conditions such as learning disability, the older the children are, the more likely you will pick up the disability. So the diagnosis, the number of kids diagnosed with a condition increase with the age. In autism, you have a peak in a younger age. So that distribution with the age is very consistent with a very rapid increase. Another fact, if we were better at diagnosing, we will expect that we will have the same proportion of children with autism who have a non-genetic disorder, such as Fragile X. In the 80s and 90s, Fragile X in autism was around 8%. Now we are well below 1%. So if we were just better at diagnosing, we would expect still the same percentage. So clearly we have more kids now, and they are different. But, we call them autism because they have social, communication, behavioral impairment. But what do we have? And I think going back to that question, is it a modern disease affecting our children? And is it due to the fact that they are still developing, their brain is developing, the brain-blood barrier is not fully formed? If you withdraw from learning, you will have huge consequences in terms of your functioning, including impact on communication, social skill, and so forth. So, what is going on? Perhaps it's not autism, perhaps it's something that just looks like that. But the problem is we have all these kids who are generally unwell.
Heather.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, again, not to pull away from the topic of autism, but look across the board at childhood conditions, whether it be obesity, allergies, severe allergies, life-threatening allergies, whether it be eczema, asthma. So there's a whole range of autoimmune conditions as well that we have seen grow exponentially. So it is not, so something is impacting all of our children at some level, not just a few that are vulnerable, but at some level, we're all on a continuous spectrum that modern living is impacting, because you can't explain, although genetics is very helpful for helping us navigate what special, personalized direction one might take to help a child feel better, as you said, and be happier and live more independently. It's helpful, but it can't be the answer. We can't see genetics causing a massive shift like we've seen over the last 20 or so years. If you speak to a physician or let's say a chiropractor or a teacher in a school, if that's been doing that for 30 or 40 years, they're looking at a very different bone structure than they did 30 years ago. They're looking at a very different gastrointestinal function than they did 30 years ago. They're looking at a very different behavioral system in the schools, or system, call it behavioral manifestation. So the teachers that have been at this for 30 or 40 years, I think they're the place. And as you said, Lorene, they're taking statistics also. They're the ones that are really seeing this huge shift in the time that they've been teaching in 30 or 40 years.
Okay, so let's get into what's potentially going on and what the contributors can be. I know, Lorene, you're talking at the Food for the Brain Smart Kids conference. Before you, we sort of take it in sequence to some extent. We have Professor Michael Crawford, who pioneered work on the effects of seafood, which is not just omega-3, but it's also B12 and phospholipids and iodine and selenium and all sorts of other things. Impacting neurodevelopment in the fetus and infant. And we also have Professor Michelle Murphy with her excellent work on homocysteine levels in pregnant women and the knock-on effects through to children. We're talking about the maternal environment. When is the window of influence? Is it the month before a woman gets pregnant? Is it the day before? Is it that critical first 1, 2, or 3 months, trimesters? Let's just go a little bit into what we are learning about the maternal environment and how it may increase the risk of a child having autistic or neurodivergent tendencies. Lorene, would you like to comment?
I'm happy to comment, to go on that. But basically, all stages are important, from preconception to throughout the pregnancy and postnatally and perinatally. So in terms of the preconception, we have potential exposure to xenobiotics. So these are toxins, heavy metals, pesticide, air pollution. We have the nutrition of the mother, which is also important, folate, methylation factor, vitamin D, omega, choline, iodine, and also the state of the immune system of the mother. Persistent viral infection, persistent bacterial infection, all of this potentially will set the scene for a more tricky pregnancy. And basically all the stages, they have key stages because of course you have neurologic development during the first trimester. Then you have maturation of the nervous system at a later stage, but each of these stages will be sensitive to toxin and lack of nutrients.
For those who, sorry, yes, please go ahead.
I was just going to add that there is a multi-generational factor here too, and Lorene is absolutely right. Every stage matters, but we're talking about this even goes back to kind of like the post-World War II industrial era. I mean, if you think about how important the microbiome is in autism, and there's tons of medical literature pointing to how lack of diversity in the microbiome is a feature of individuals with autism and contributes to the symptomology. Well, that lack of microbial diversity really goes back to when we started putting poisons into the environment in terms of pesticides, herbicides, toxic chemicals, petrochemicals, but also, and very importantly, the development of the sulfa drugs in the 1930s, followed by our antibiotics that are used ubiquitously. And if you think about our grandparents, when they had their, especially our grandmothers, when they had their first round of antibiotics, that irrevocably changes that microbiome, which is then passed down to the mother, who probably had 3, 4, 5 rounds of antibiotics, plus birth control pills and other kinds of things that affect the microbiome. And then that is then passed down to the next generation. So you're talking about multiple generations of microbiome perturbations that result in a lack of diversity in the microbiome of infants born today. And that has very real consequences linking it to autism. And it doesn't just have to be about something tangible like the microbiome. I know Heather's done a lot of research in this area, which is epigenetics. And there's a researcher at the University of Texas named Claudia Miller, who has identified that parents who have immune activation prior to conception, so mast cell activation, who have multiple chemical sensitivity, who have this immune priming prior to conceiving their child, are passing along an epigenetic immune priming that is correlated with neurodivergent outcomes, ADS, ASD, and ADHD. So the higher your what she calls a tilt, which is like a loss of tolerance to chemicals and stimulants in your environment. If you have a loss of tolerance to chemicals in your environment, you're passing that on to your child, who will then have a similar kind of immune activation. And that appears to be happening epigenetically. So it's really quite profound. And it goes back to something Heather said earlier about, like, this is modern living, and it is multiple generations of modern living that is creating this scenario.
Heather.
I just want to jump in here and maybe, because I don't know, we only have an hour to spend together, is move the dial a little bit on into the direction of hope. And that's what our organization is about. It's documenting hope. And I know that's what Lorene, I believe you got into this work as well, because we saw that there was opportunity amongst all these obstacles to health right now to create a better future, to help parents prepare, to potentially reverse a lot of those symptoms that we've talked about, that we use those biomarkers not so much just to identify and report the gloom and doom that's happening internal to the body, but giving us a compass for navigating out of that. Just to put it in a very simple way, I think we're looking at what is adding to the burden, in modern times of what we call the total load. What is then detracting from that in the sense of having a deficiency? So what do we have kind of in a Goldilocks way too much of in our bodies and our brains? And what do we have too little of? What nutrients are lacking? And then also, as Lorene was talking about, and Beth, there is our points of dysregulation. We are a bioregulatory organism. We're a system of systems that are trying to work together. So if whether it's in utero or preconception, that there is this setup for something to be derailed or dysregulated, then what are the modalities and supports we have in place to help people regain, or children regain, their bioregulation? And I think that's where we've stayed the course in this work, because we not only want to know what might be the underlying causes and how we lower the burden and elevate the supports, but also how to bring people back into alignment, into homeostasis, into what we call that zone of, coming, that you can handle stress, the resilience. And so
yes, and I'm very much looking forward to your combined public webinar on April the 24th, foodforthebrain.org/smartkids, where I know you'll go into that. I'm sort of hearing nutrients and the term that one of our professors coined many years ago, anti-nutrients, things that interfere with that process. And I'm also hearing a lot of immune system, and I'd like to go into those areas. But just for those listening, very, very simple things like lack of folate, B12, raised homocysteine, faulty methylation, all of these actually increase the probability of a child having autism. Seafood is very interesting. The study on almost 12,000 pregnant women, the ALSPAC study in Bristol, Avon, again, very clearly linking seafood consumption. The less seafood, the more likelihood there are of problems. And only 2 weeks ago, a follow-up study of that on 6,000 children showing us a direct link. And this isn't just autism we're talking about here. It's what they call pro-social behavior, or a lack of pro-social behavior, which, in English is a bit more antisocial behavior, less ability to connect, to socialize, more aggression, and that kind of thing. But you all mentioned the immune system and the issues that would occur with a woman who has an activated immune system, maybe, allergic, inflammatory, asthma, gut, other such issues. But one thing I think I would be remiss if I didn't, ask you about is vaccines. And, the reason I say this is that I've worked in special educational needs schools, and I've had parents who've come up to me and they say, without a doubt, my child was normal in speech and then became, unable to, to communicate with speech directly after, usually MMR. And in fact, I was building a house down here in Wales, and the roofer said, you know something about autism, don't you? And I said, well, a bit. And he said, yes, my child has autism. And I said, what do you know about that? And they said, completely normal, had an MMR, and within, I don't know, a day or two, non-verbal. So I know this is a terribly hot potato, but I think it would be inappropriate to not at least raise it. Lorene, what do you know about the facts of this?
Yeah, well, thank you for raising this, Patrick. I think in this day and age, it's very controversial to raise the issue of vaccination and autism. There's been many studies done who have said there is no association with vaccination, but the story you say, Patrick, is a story I hear all the time. So parents come to me, and in my group, I have about 26%. This is when I looked at a fairly large, close to 400 children. 26% report this very sharp association of loss of skills after this particular vaccine. I did not include in this 26% those whose parents feel it was very gradual, but there is also some family who said from that point it was never quite the same. We started to have very frequent illnesses, ear infections, throat, bronchiolitis. We started to have digestive issues. The child started to restrict their diet. But I only consider this very sharp regression. So we have kids who have seizures, who are admitted to A&E and so forth. So it's quite dramatic. And some of them, as this person you referred to, have lost their language completely. And that can be super hard to reverse. And I like to say that in some ethnic background, Somali, we have a huge community in the UK with Somali background in various communities. Bristol, the rate of regression following MMR is higher, still is around 40%. And the consequences are, for the majority, 77, they become non-verbal and very autistic.
Yeah, we had Dr. Paul Shattuck, and he was involved in a study of 824 children who had very, very tight inclusion criteria for autistic spectrum disorders, and the parents attributed, in this case, regression to the MMR, 55 out of 824, which would relate to 6.7% or 1 in 15 children. Obviously, and it's not just MMR, but most children, have vaccines, no problem at all. So this is not an anti-vax thing, but there is a phenomena here which seems to occur. Heather, Beth, in your experience, is this playing a role?
I think it's important to frame this entire conversation in the context of what autism is again, right? So we kind of didn't touch too much on it, but autism is largely a neuroinflammatory condition. There is documentation of autoimmunity. It is largely an autoimmune condition. It is a metabolic condition, is all these things, which then you have to start looking at, all right, well, what triggered the autoimmunity? What precipitated the autoimmunity? What precipitates the metabolic issues? And that's a complex thing. And then if you think about what causes neuroinflammation, many things can cause neuroinflammation. Many things can contribute to autoimmunity. Toxins do. And when it comes to vaccines, there is documentation, there's entire textbooks that link vaccines to autoimmunity, that vaccines actually can play a role in triggering autoimmune diseases, exacerbating autoimmune diseases. So what needs to be done is people need to look at this question with an open mind and say, why can't we challenge the fact that maybe childhood vaccines are playing a role in triggering neuroinflammation and triggering autoimmunity, instead of just, saying out of hand that that's not possible because people are too worried about threatening that program and threatening, the compliance with that program. So we need to have an honest discussion about the role that anything could be playing in neuroinflammation. Antibiotics can play a role in neuroinflammation, opens up the blood-brain barrier. So think about the combination of antibiotics plus a vaccine, or antibiotics plus a natural infection. Those kinds of things need to be looked at not as singular issues. They need to be looked at as part of the total load. What is this child's vulnerability coming into their well baby visit at 12 months or 18 months? Like, do they have gut issues? Do they have a toxic load? Do they have nutritional deficiencies that would make them more vulnerable to an immune assault from a vaccine that perhaps they're not ready to tolerate or not able to tolerate?
It's such a vital thing, really, because if we only did that research, we could maybe find those where this wouldn't be the right route to go. and save so much misery. And it broke my heart because my Wikipedia entry actually got shut down 10 years ago. There is nothing in the last 10 years simply because somebody put in a statement that at some point I had considered the possibility that a small number of cases of autism might, have been triggered in this way. So you're all talking about total load. That seems to be if there's two words I would take out of this, it is total load. And unless you have something particular more you wish to say about vaccines, I'd kind of like to bounce into the good news. Heather
But
said
one,
it's yes,
if I could
Lorene,
just add,
please.
Patrick, is, very often I'm asked that question by parents, and it's not my role to tell parents what to do. However, I do point to this excellent book from Richard Halvorsen, which obviously
Richard
yes,
Halvorsen,
Halvorsen,
Dr.
yeah,
Richard Halvorsen, a GP, and I know his backstory. I don't know if you
yeah.
do, but he's been the
Well,
advisor to our.
if you want to explain more, Patrick, please do.
Well, yeah, he was actually a very good GP, focusing on kids who decided he might want to move into medical journalism and come like one of those TV doctors and that kind of thing. And I forget which TV channel, BBC or otherwise, but they basically gave him an assignment that there's this ridiculous idea out there, that the vaccines could trigger, autism. And he thought it was ridiculous. That's where he started from. So as a medic, a GP, going into medical journalism and research, that was his first assignment. And he was absolutely shocked
Yeah.
by what he found. And I remember, because I've interviewed him on my podcast as well. If I remember him correctly, I think the most shocking thing he found was no studies beyond 3 months.
Sure.
No actual long-term studies of, potential adverse effects of vaccines beyond the immediate, let alone studies now on the combination of many. So that's how he got into it and set up baby jabs, because in his opinion, a single measles vaccine has very little risk. So at least a parent could have the choice if they wish to have the measles vaccine, and mumps and rubella, which are the other MMR, are not really relevant until the child hits puberty, so they could be delayed. And his research also showed, very often you get just as much effectiveness of a vaccine delayed, not all put, in the first 6 months of life and so on. So yes, Richard Halvorsen, very, very good book on this subject, very good doctor. And he is our go-to guy, now retired. So yeah, the issue I wanted to ask is you've worked with hundreds of children and adults diagnosed with autism or neurodivergence as well. And what is the message of hope? So generally speaking, what sort of success rate are you getting, and what does success look like? Maybe I'll turn Heather first to you, and then I'll ask Lorene.
Well, a specific story comes to mind for me, which is of a young man who I started seeing probably a dozen years ago with the diagnosis of autism, non-speaking, and dysregulated, I guess you'd say, certain behaviors and things and repetition, who has now in his 30s, just gotten access to, in the last few years, the ability to write, to spell using his large muscles. So for somebody who has a condition called apraxia, where there is no access to those very fine motor skills like we are required to use for all of our studies on intelligence and IQ, he doesn't have access to any of those small motor functions, but was taught to spell using larger motor, first pointing to letters and then ultimately is working toward maybe a keyboard and maybe fine-tuning that. So this is a child who was, or man now, who was considered to be severely autistic, committed eventually to a home where where he would be provided for. So with access to the spelling, just that alone, a modality of communication, so giving agency to a child that didn't have agency in that area, is not only revealing to us that this is somebody not with a low IQ, but this is somebody with a very high IQ who would love to become a cell biologist, who would has already learned to speak Spanish, even though the family doesn't, who is very optimistic about the future because there's an opening to understanding that it's not, that there was something that was distorted or dysregulated, but there is hope that these people that are now communicating are part of the solution. They've lived in that kind of body of a prison, so to speak, that disallowed them function that would allow them to pursue their own dreams. So he never even thought it was possible to pursue his dreams. And now he suddenly has this availed to him. And one of the things that he wrote to his mother, who is providing that kind of helping with that training of writing, has a specialized teacher beyond the family. But he said to her, he wrote to her one day, "Mom, I don't have autism." This is so a parent that's lived with, 30 years of 30, now 4 years, because again, this was a shift at about age 2 when it became more evident. He said, "I don't have autism." And she said, "Well, what do you have?" He said, "I have apraxia and I want to speak." So that's an extreme case of dysregulation, inability to access that, but we give a communication tool that allows him to be part of the solution toward his own hope and future. That isn't just a crutch, but that is like insight into what things were helpful and what things were harmful along his trajectory.
And that is a wonderful story of, transformation and gaining function, really.
Yes.
And in the world of documenting hope, which many people in the UK are not aware of, and I'll ask you to give your details out a little bit later and invite you all to come to the April 24th event. But, have you guys helped hundreds, thousands? What sort of numbers are involved? How many people tend to improve? What do they tend to improve in? And, if you could, we've mentioned quite a few complex processes, which clearly need full investigation. But, if you had a wish list of, half a dozen things that everyone had, whether it's a nutrient or not having an anti-nutrient, what are the sort of big hitters that you think are absolutely vital for parents to be aware of?
That are foundational. There are some foundational things that we know you can have agency to help your child have more agency with certain foundational things that you want, or what different people maybe call pillars. Okay. So dietarily is huge. That's a large source of our incoming total load, and it's a hopeful source of our nourishment.
And what are we talking about diet-wise? What are we saying?
Yeah, well, so I'll let people get into little particulars about what we have replaced in individuals that we know that's either missing, or we look at biomarkers downstream that say, oh my gosh, they probably don't have any B12 in their brain, or any magnesium, or any vitamin D, or their folate, or that kind of thing. Or so those things aside, I will point to Julie Matthews' recent research on looking at across the board at all diets for autism and what rose to the top. You've got gluten-free, casein-free. We know that those create chemicals in the body that can contribute to brain inflammation, and the inability to break those down, or only partially broken down, can create brain inflammation and other neurologic toxicity. But she looked at all of those diets, low phenols, salicylates, you name it. And the most valuable of them, doesn't mean it's the only, it doesn't mean that there aren't profound changes with one or the other, but the most valuable was whole foods, whole complete foods, non-processed foods, things that we would identify what they look like in nature, not what they look like on the shelf with lots of ingredients that we cannot pronounce. So that's like foundational.
So we got whole foods, we got vitamin D, magnesium, B vitamins, omega-3s, potentially gluten, casein-free diet. Lorene, in these pillars, what would you like to add to? And
I
perhaps
just
you can
wanted
give us
to
the numbers in your particular experience.
happy to put the numbers, but I just wanted to add on the whole food. It can be extremely challenging for some families to put this in place because the children very often have sensory issues and severe food restriction. So we have to take a behavioral approach to help not only the parents to know how to do it. So we can't just give them a list. These are the food we want your kid to eat. We have to help them to put this in place with desensitization, pairing with other food, and so forth, to progressively shift that diet. Gluten, casein, we talked about it, potentially problematic. But here is very, very important that we have the whole food concept, because not uncommonly parents read this online and they will buy everything gluten-free. So they will have gluten-free pizza, they will have gluten-free chicken nuggets, gluten-free bread, gluten-free everything. And basically now we're having a completely processed food diet, essentially no vegetables, there's still very high sugar and so forth. So that is not a suitable gluten-free, casein-free diet. So just wanted to mention this because it's actually can be very complex to change the diet of these children.
No, I remember we had a case and taught actually the child would only eat pizza. Well, that was the starting point, and was very, very sensitive to gluten and casein. And we did actually show them how to make a gluten-free and casein-free pizza with some actual vegetables. It went in the Domino pizza box,
Yes.
out the back window.
Yes.
And then the father would arrive through the front with this, and the child would eat it, and then started to have some major improvement. And only then could you start to really work on
That's right.
whole foods. So how many children have you worked with, Lorene, and what is a sort of a normal expectation of improvement in, improving symptoms and so on?
Yes. So, I mean, I've worked with well over 1,000 children. So I see children coming from all ages, 2 or younger, but not commonly older still. I'm not in a position, unfortunately, to do any kind of rigorous research. So I have partnered in the past with an organization called Thinking Autism to basically give some survey, which is a very soft way of doing an assessment of the outcomes. And in this survey, we found about 53% of the families reported very beneficial outcomes to the intervention. So this is generally, first of all, we have improvement in physical symptoms, digestive, immune, sleep, interest for food. These are the first changes we see. Then we start seeing the child is more receptive to others, more interested in the world around them. And only then we start having improvement with regard to the cognitive skills and with regard to the attention and ability to speak. We have to really appreciate that speaking is a very complex skill. And you first need to improve all this. It's almost like an onion, and I often talk about layers. We start from the outer layer, which are physical, and we go more inwards toward cognitive, neurological layers.
And
So,
you mentioned 1,000. How
yes.
many have not responded? What's the
Well,
success rate?
it's very rare. Around 5% of individuals are what we have non-responder. But I want to stress, though, although we have very good outcome for some children and some have lost completely the diagnosis. So they are in mainstream. I have a number of individuals I have been fortunate to follow until their adulthood, mostly because they still have an immune vulnerability, allergies, and sometimes they get more sick and so forth. But basically they are studying at university, they have friends, they're completely independent. So that is definitely is the case, and they no longer fulfill the criteria of autism. But it still is a very small proportion. we have some very lucky cases in which you don't need to do much. You could just do the diet, you just do the key nutrients, and then you have massive improvement. But you have other cases where it's much harder, and you do everything you can. You would test everything. We talk about pandas, encephalitis, epilepsy. Some of the gut issues are very, very difficult to fully address. Rebalancing the gut microbiome can be very hard. So parents are really trying hard. In the US and in the UK, they go abroad, they eventually go to stem cells. So we have quite a range of layers of intervention from quite minimal to much more intensive.
That's amazing. And Beth, what's your experience in the US? What are the sort of numbers, the success rates, and so on?
So I don't think anyone's actually tracking the success rates or what we might use the word recovery. A lot of times what happens is these families who achieve this kind of diagnosis reversal, they kind of go underground, meaning they get to this point where they're like, my child can now participate in mainstream. And because there's stigma around the word autism, sometimes they don't want to be tracked. They don't want to share their story. We've been documenting the stories of these kids overcoming their diagnoses and symptoms for 15 years. And the one thing I will say is that, there is no protocol. This is so bio-individual, just as Lorene was just saying, that there is, cases where kids can very easily overcome their symptoms and drop their diagnoses, and some that would do everything imaginable and never get there. And that's because what got them to the status of this autism diagnosis in the first place is so variable. And it needs to be really approached through personalized medicine, N of one kind of medicine, where you're looking at each individual. However, I will say that there are some common features to all those stories of kids who've gotten better. There's always nutrition involved. There is always this attempt to reduce that total load, remove the stressors from that child's environment, whether those are toxic stressors, emotional stressors, Wi-Fi, EMF. Bring down that total load, and then also increase health supports. That means getting outside in nature, living in sync with nature, getting routine sleep, and getting to the place where they can stool regularly and detox regularly. Those are some of the basics, as Heather was saying, that the word foundational that apply for everybody, and everybody's going to see some improvement from getting those foundations in place. But beyond that, then it gets real bio-individual, and that's where a skilled clinician can be very helpful in getting past the foundational pieces and what each individual child needs.
And as we move to the end of this fascinating podcast, how can people find out about your organization? How can they get specialized help along these lines stateside?
So documentinghope.com is the place to find us. You can also follow us on most social media platforms as at Documenting Hope. One of the things that we developed to help parents move through this journey with their children is a private healing membership community. It's called Healing Together. And we invite parents to come in and learn some of those foundationals. We have educational materials and educational support. We also have live calls with Dr. Heather here. And we also have live calls with health coaches who can help answer your questions about, different kinds of tests you may be doing or different diets you may be trying or what have you. And so we have also a online library of webinars and articles that parents can come in, use our search bar, and find information that's relevant to them. So documentinghope.com is the best place to find us.
And is that how somebody could connect with you, Heather, as well?
Absolutely, yes. In terms of my work with Documenting Hope, primarily that I also have a small private practice, but I'm in the process of moving, and so that's TBD right now as to where I will be as a clinician.
Good luck with
but
the movement.
You can always you can always find Dr. Heather on documentinghope.com. She's there hosting live calls once a month.
Fantastic. And it is a wonderful wonderful website. And Dr. Lorene Amet, how can people access your wonderful wisdom and helpful healing practice?
The lauristoncentre.co.uk in one word.
The Lauriston Centre. I'm going to spell that. I love your French accent. Lauriston, lauristoncentre.co.uk.
Yes, which is an organization which was very recently founded. However, I have been working in the field of autism for over 20 years, charity, public health as well. But just want to say this center is to also look at the health of the parents, because very much, as has been said today, we have immune problem in the parents, or stress issues, health issues, their own nutrition is also not necessarily optimal. And we feel very strongly that parents have to be as healthy and as strong as possible to support their child with autism.
Well, I want to thank you all for your amazing wisdom, knowledge, humanitarian good wishes, because that is what is driving all of this, is how to help children and all of us, but children be the best that they possibly can be. Heather wants to make a quick point.
My quick point is I want parents to know that you are not alone. We're listening.
That's a good message. And also, if you want to listen some more and go into this conversation in more detail, please do come to foodforthebrain.org/smartkids. And there you will find a public webinar with Dr. Heather, Dr. Lorene, and Beth Lambert. That is designed for parents, so to speak. And also, if you are a health professional, on the very same day, this is April the 24th, the public event is in the evening. In the daytime, we have a phenomenal conference with Assistant Professor Chris D'Adamo, who's researching with the Document Hope group, and will be sharing his research. We have Professor Michelle Murphy on homocysteine and B vitamins and methylation, and we have Professor Michael Crawford. We have Dr. Alex Richardson, one of the world's experts in ADHD, although often she says, forget the label, let's get right in there into the nutrition. We're going to be exploring anti-nutrients with Dr. Chris Ganage. There are so many other people, a wonderful naturopath from Canada, Karen Jensen, and the head of our own Smart Kids program, Natalie Coughlin, and also our sugar daddy, or no sugar daddy, as we call him, Professor Robert Lustig, talking about the impact of sugar. And Karen and Natalie will be talking about how to train your dragon. So it's not just about autism. This is about optimum nutrition and optimum life and optimum living and optimum environment for wonderful, fantastic, healthy kids. So I really want to thank Dr. Heather Tellman-Room and Beth Lambert and Dr. Lorene Amet for shining the light on this very important subject of autism and neurodivergence, and how we can help our children be the best they can possibly be. Thank you very much for your expertise and your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick.